The Emperor of Mankind is the single most important figure in Warhammer 40K, bar none. The many decades of lore we've been given about him is hands down the most important lore in the entire setting. But was he a failure who ultimately led humanity into damnation, the most selfless hero who ever lived, or something in between? The short answer is yes, and it's complicated. But if you want a more thorough look at just who the Emperor is and why he did what he did, then you're in the right place. So in this video, I'm going to go deep into just who the Emperor is. We'll begin with his birth and early life and continue through the Unification Wars and the Great Crusade. And before we get too far in, I just have to say that I have had to really re-examine how I feel about Big E since making this video. Some of the things that he did that I just disagreed with for decades, I am now finding that I see the justification for, and vice versa. But this just may be due to the fact that recently much of the lore surrounding the Emperor's early life, and ultimately his death, has been retconned. So without further ado, the being that would eventually become known as the God Emperor of Mankind was born in Anatolia, what is now modern-day Turkey, during the transitional period of human civilization that saw the birth of the Bronze Age. He was born to normal, regular parents despite the intense nature of his conception. During this time in early civilization, when the human race was just beginning to wake up to its psychic potential, and the earliest human psykers were just emerging on the scene, the Emperor came to be. The shaman were basically the first sort of proto-psykers of the human race, and they were being consumed upon death, their souls devoured in the warp by dark entities that were just beginning to stir. The gestating chaos gods. The dark gods grew in power as the shaman would incarnate, live, die, and have their souls consumed. These proto-psykers were used to reincarnating after death, their souls coming back again and again, carrying forward the occult knowledge they'd acquired through their many lifetimes. So eventually the shaman were able to piece together what was happening. They foresaw that without the psychic might that humanity was starting to develop, the entirety of the human race would end up extinct as chaos swelled in power. The entirety of humanity feeding their ever-growing hunger. And the shaman came up with a plan, so that upon death, they wouldn't have to worry about being consumed, nor would they have to worry about reincarnating. However, it would come at a terrible cost, a massive sacrifice. And remember that word, sacrifice, as it is one of the common themes that plays out again and again over the millennia of the Emperor's existence. The shaman held a conclave, and during this great meeting, came up with a plan to commit mass unaliving, and sent all their souls to the warp at once. This overwhelmed the proto-dark gods, and the soul energies merged into one cohesive super soul, essentially. And this burned the warp entities, a massive flame that lit them up and drove them back, as the souls became one united essence and one unified force that hit the warp like a nuclear bomb. And thus the Emperor was conceived, in the warp, born upon the sacrifice of thousands of early psykers, the combined essence of thousands of lifetimes, each having themselves reincarnated many times. The ultimate human came to be. And this part about the shaman and how they all ascended into one being is one of the major things that was changed. Now he is simply considered to be the first true psyker and perpetual, an extraordinary mutant who is the reincarnation of the extinct shaman. Still somehow collectively, thousands of shaman, but Games Workshop now really seem to be trying to distance themselves from the original Heaven's Gate sort of storyline, and I honestly don't really blame them. The current lore just states that nothing is really known about the Emperor, and Imperial records mention him first during the Age of Strife. So now he is basically just a mutant warlord super psyker who is the collective souls of shaman who had each themselves reincarnated countless times, and he is in touch with those lives more and more as time progresses, giving him access to a vast wealth of knowledge, both historical and metaphysical. Horus later on does state that he knows that his father, the Emperor, was born and lived his own childhood in Anatolia. His physical birth occurred exactly 1 year after the shaman's conclave, and he was born to a normal family of farmers and herders, sometime around 10 to 11,000 years before our current time here in the 21st century, near the river Sakarya. His psychic powers were so strong that in the womb his DNA was basically altered, and the effect was that it rendered him a perpetual. So strong was his might in the metaphysical realm that it made his body effectively immortal. This was quite a boon, as it meant that the warp would not claim him and consume him upon death. The Emperor would simply rejuvenate, returning to life and thus denying the dark powers their ultimate meal. In his early life, the Emperor lived pretty much like anyone else in his village, but one day his father died. And this didn't set well with the Emperor, who may have opened up his might for the first real time and gotten in touch with his psychic powers due to his heightened emotional state. The Emperor received a clairvoyant vision and knew the truth, that his uncle had slain his father. Empowered with that knowledge, the child who would become the master of mankind used telekinesis to stop his uncle's heart, slaying him outright. But the Emperor did not take any pleasure at the act, nor did he show sorrow. It was pretty much just absolutely pragmatic, and even though it was his grief that led him to get in touch with his true power, he did not kill his uncle out of any sort of emotional reaction. It was purely calculated and cold-blooded, which seems quite appropriate. After slaying his uncle, the new man, as he came to be known, realized that humanity needed direction, some sort of law and order to guide and govern them, and so went to Mesopotamia, to one of the earliest human cities, perhaps as it was said to literally be the first human city. Now, it has been said that the Emperor never lived openly during this era as the new man, and lived many lives under many identities, always trying to steer humanity in the right direction by promoting peace and harmony. It is never explicitly stated that he was Hammurabi, but it is hinted at, and would be appropriate, as Hammurabi is recorded as the first king to come up with a code of ethics for his subjects to live and abide by, basically inventing the law. But there are many places in the lore that let us know some of the many identities throughout history that were just cover identities for the Emperor. For one, he is known to have been Alexander the Great, and it has been widely speculated and hinted at by Games Workshop, and if I recall correctly, was overtly stated to be Jesus of Nazareth and Muhammad as well. But no matter what form and identity the Emperor of mankind took, he was never able to unify humanity under one purpose, under one vision. And it was during this time that those dark energies in the warp became full-blown chaos gods, having siphoned off enough of humanity's psychic energies to fully manifest in the warp as unique individual beings. The first god, Khorne, came to be, and the world was plunged into darkness and warfare. Soon, Tzeentch followed, and intrigue and politics became convoluted and complicated. Finally, Nurgle arose during the Great Plagues of the Middle Ages. And then the Emperor truly had enemies, and was aware of these new, malignant presences that were spawned by the darkest extremes of human nature. He attempted to persuade people to live in peace, as that would stop feeding the dark powers. During the 20th millennium, approximately during the Age of Technology, when humans built their first star-spanning civilization, the Emperor left Terra for a while, traveling on a ship that was very slow indeed, as it was before humans were capable of warp travel to go faster than light. He set out from Terra with a group of perpetuals, including his best friend Malcador and Olivia Surica, who shows up throughout many of the novels. The Emperor wants to unite humanity and bring every planet that was colonized by humans under one banner, though this was still thousands of years before he unified Terra. But the lack of faster-than-light travel is impeding any progress. So Big E travels to the planet Molech, and there finds a warp gate. Now, there's a lot of speculation and assumption going on in the community when it comes to just what happened in the warp. Some of the dominant theories are that the Emperor made a deal with the Chaos Gods, and that the Emperor stole power from the gods. We don't know for sure exactly what happened on Molech. That is yet to be completely revealed to us. But we do know that many of the other perpetuals with the Emperor pretty much stopped hanging out with him and found what he did to be distasteful. Some claimed that he stole fire from the gods, referencing the Greek myth of Prometheus taking knowledge from the gods and being punished for giving it to humans. But whatever the Emperor got, it was a huge power-up. He became extremely powerful, as if he had drank deep of the stuff of the warp itself and become swollen with its power. Astropaths began to spring up on human worlds, and interstellar travel sped up to incredible speeds as warp travel became possible. But not all the other perpetuals were good with that even, as some stated that using the power of the warp to fight the dark gods of the warp was moving backwards, traveling in the wrong direction and creating possible future problems. But it was after Moloch that Malkador said the Emperor had truly changed into something truly godlike. And while there is so much fan speculation as to what happened, and we know that many of the Perpetuals abandoned the Emperor after Moloch, we do get a couple of characters who were there remembering and referencing what happened in the End and the Death books. First, we have Malkador, sitting upon the Golden Throne at the Siege of Terra, so more than 10,000 years after Moloch, as the Emperor boards the Vengeful Spirit in the final confrontation of his life. You have brought the Emperor face to face with chaos first found, closer than when he sat upon the throne or walked the shrieking halls of the webway, perhaps closer even than when he last faced the Four and took their fire from them on Moloch. You have brought chaos to his very door and forced him to look it in the eye. Do not then expect him not to use it. I see him look down at his hands. They are sheathed in auramite because it is almost quantum inert and thus most efficacious in the manipulation of immaterial forces. Bare skin is better. This much he knows. He tears his right gauntlet off, hangs it from his harness, and seizes the immaterium with bare hand and a bared mind. It is scalding and alive with anger, but my lord is no longer constrained by the constant duties of the throne. That is my burden now. There is no time. There are no clocks. There is no pain. My master hears only the crackle of the warp. I watch as he harnesses that sound and uses it as a focus, a drishti, to regulate his work. The immaterial presses at him. It seeks to overwhelm and drain him, but he underestimates its fire. It is the same fire he stole from the Four Annihilators and used to keep them at bay, the same fire he has wielded for centuries to drive them back whenever they have come too close. They flinched then from their own fire. They flinch now. You have forced this confrontation first found. You have brought my lord into a realm of chaos to face you. Did you think that would weaken him and grind him down? How can he grow weak when there is limitless power around him to draw upon? You do not put out a fire by throwing fuel upon it. He draws upon your flames. Over the millennia he has worn many masks, each suitable to the task at hand. His mind, his greatest gift, allows him flexibility in such things. Now you see him at his truest aspect, as terrible as he can be when terror is the only recourse. He is Ordo ab Chao. He is Lux in Tenebris. And later we see a custodian speaking about the Emperor and what he had become, or had to do on Moloch, also from the End and the Death. The Master of Mankind continues to draw upon the very power unleashed against him. He steals it, just as he stole fire on Moloch, and hurls it back. He casts flame storms from his fingertips with such force that the shrilling Neverborn, live birthed out of the vortex, incinerate before they have full substance, and the ship's corridors, briefly recalling the metal from which they were once made, burst and shred from the overpressure. His sword, a blade of blazing sunlight, cleaves materia and immateria alike, and fills the air with scalding blood steam. His fury is boundless. So is this hell. The bestial Neverborn, instantiate everywhere, massed in wailing legions of the damned, the manifest armies of pandemonium, in unvanquishable numbers. They seek to kill him, not just in body, but his entirety. Horns and fangs and slicing talons swarm to shred him, to tear armor from flesh, and flesh from bone, and soul from body. They seek to destroy not just his mortal shell, but the perpetual spark within him. He will not be beaten, he will not be turned back, though chaos assaults the Emperor with unprecedented ire, unleashing its power in a condensed paroxysm that exceeds all the warp events in human history. He will not back down. He meets the excess of chaos with its own excess, pushing his power beyond any cautious restrictions he has previously respected. He has always been a conduit too, resilient enough to tolerate the burning wire of immaterial force that sizzles in his blood. He has been training himself to stand it for more than 30,000 years. He has conditioned himself to bear its force, to tap it, to use it, to inhale its fire and breathe it back in the faces of the Chaos Pantheon. They have opened the sunless sea of the Empyrean to him, and so he drinks from it to magnify his own almighty power. The false four are fools if they think this display of excess can overwhelm him. It empowers him, Horus Lupercal. It empowers him. It feeds him in excess of his own. He is set on this path first found, and he will find his way to you. He will carve a sure and inexorable road through your labyrinth of madness, his sword in his right hand and fire in his left, and meet you. He will find you. Now, both Malcador and the Custodian have interesting perspectives on what happened, and they don't definitely say anything we couldn't infer already. However, one thing we do know is that for whatever reason, whether he stole power, was simply able to get in touch with power, or whether he made a deal with the Chaos Gods themselves, we do know that he came away from Molech a much more powerful psyker, and capable of many of the things we know him for later in the timeline. But the main thing he had was new knowledge, the knowledge of how to create the primarchs and the Space Marine legions of the Adeptus Astartes, and to spread the light of Terra across the galaxy. But before the Emperor could use his newly gained powers, humanity would plunge into an age of darkness and despair unlike anything it had ever known. The age of technology gave way to the age of strife, an apocalyptic nightmare that humanity was barely able to survive. Tens of billions died from disease, famine, and constant warfare as the golden age of humanity that began in the age of technology fell apart, and the Emperor realized that if humanity was to survive, he would have to unite all of us under his glorious rule. But first, he had to conquer Terra. And this is where we get to the Unification Wars and the dawning of the Imperium of Man, where the being whose friends and companions knew him as Neoth would become the Emperor of Mankind. So, far in our future, in the 29th millennium, the Emperor set out to truly unite humanity under one banner, his. Terra was ruled by various warlords known as techno-barbarians, of which the Emperor was considered to be among the strongest at the time, though current imperial records do not refer to him with such crude and basic titles. It was this campaign against the other techno-barbarians that became known as the Unification Wars. And this series of massive conflicts raged across the globe, leaving untold dead in its wake. This was the first time the Emperor would employ the use of genetically enhanced super soldiers. He created his Thunder Warriors to bring the techno-barbarians and their armies to their knees. Using chemical and genetic enhancement along with bionic implantation, this was kind of a rushed process that he was using on adults, many of which did not take the process well. Eventually, many of the Thunder Warriors perished due to their metabolism just completely collapsing. Others slowly deteriorated as they aged, becoming insane or completely psychotic. But the Thunder Warriors fighting for the Emperor were able to unify Terra, the final battle occurring at Mount Ararat. But by this time, the Thunder Warriors were aware that they had been cursed with short lifespans and horrific lives, and cursed the Emperor, and many turned on him. The Emperor unleashed his custodians, finely crafted super soldiers individually made by the Emperor himself, who served as his elite shock troops and bodyguard. Each one represented the resources of several entire worlds just to create them. And along with the Custodes, for the first time, the Space Marines of the Adeptus Astartes hit the battlefield in the form of a prototype version of the First Legion. So, in their most rudimentary form, the Dark Angels were there alongside the Custodes as the Thunder Warriors were culled. The original super soldiers destroyed in order to make way for the true force the Emperor had been working on, the Space Marines. Soldiers created from the gene seed of the primarchs, who at this point were still all lost as the Emperor had not yet recovered Horus, who would come to be known as the First Found. Unless, of course, Alfarius is to be believed, as he claims to have been found upon Terra itself and raised in secret by the Emperor and Malcador. But the Imperial propaganda that was spread was that the Thunder Warriors all died at Mount Ararat, but were able to win the day. The story went as far as to say that a lone Thunder Warrior was able to hoist the Emperor's fallen banner back up just before he died as his final act. This warrior was named Eric Tyrannus, and the irony is that he didn't even die in the battle and was even able to avoid the Custodes and Dark Angels culling the original super soldiers. But the story of the few surviving Thunder Warriors and what they went on to do is the subject of another video. So, once the ultimate generals, in the form of the primarchs, were created, the Emperor was ready to set off on the greatest undertaking in the history of humanity, the Great Crusade. Only one problem. The powers of chaos scattered the infant primarchs in their gestation pods to the warp. So during the conquest of the galaxy, the Emperor would slowly recover his lost primarchs, one by one. And it was a slow grind. But before he left the solar system, the Emperor would unify Mars and Terra, which had both controlled their own interstellar empires and been in cooperation since the age of technology, but had many falling outs. And this is probably the first thing the Emperor does that is beyond the pale. I mean, it is absolutely hypocritical. But in order to secure Martian support for him and the Imperium, and secure their technological superiority and expertise, as well as their foundries and forge worlds, which he would need for the Great Crusade, the Emperor made the deal known to Terrans as the Treaty of Mars and to the Martians as the Treaty of Olympus Mons. And in making that deal, the Emperor presented himself as a god, as what the Martian priests referred to as the Omnissiah, the machine god. And the Emperor knew this was not cool and flew in the face of everything he was about to spread as the imperial truth throughout the galaxy, but he did it, and he secured the Martian support. After some internal fighting and bloodshed, it was settled. The machine cult would be allowed to remain operating, as it respected the Emperor of mankind as their one true god. The Emperor laid the foundation for the damnation of mankind when he did this. Or, from another point of view, perhaps the Martians were truly the first people in the galaxy to recognize the divinity of Neoth, to see not just the Emperor of mankind, but the God Emperor of mankind. Praise the Omnissiah! With Martian support secured, the Emperor set out on the Great Crusade to bring the light of Terra to the galaxy. As he was aware of chaos, he thought that if he could spread an imperial cult of absolute atheism and disbelief, and what he called false gods, then he could deprive the Chaos Gods of any worship from humanity and starve them out. Horus was the first Primarch that Imperial records state was found. He was basically with the Emperor as the only Primarch for over an entire regular human lifetime before another Primarch was found. He got to know the Emperor one-on-one in a way the other generals of the legions never would, and often gets referred to as the Emperor's favorite son. Horus Lupercal, of the planet of Chthoniya, which was so close to Terra it could actually be reached with sublight engines. As Horus and the Emperor fought their way across the galaxy, they destroyed entire alien civilizations that stood in the way of the Imperium's expansion and hegemonic dominance of the galaxy. They scourged human empires that would not become compliant. They fought side by side against endless waves of orcs, and on more than one occasion saved each other's lives. They discovered new worlds for humans to populate and uncovered old forgotten worlds with human colonies that had been lost since the age of technology, and it was amazing what they were able to accomplish, spreading the imperial truth far and wide. Until the second Primarch discovery happened, and the Emperor met his son, Leman Russ. Now, Russ was nothing like Horus, which took Horus aback. Russ had a code of chivalry and honor and perhaps the fiercest loyalty of any Primarch. Well, it can be argued at least. But Russ was a barbarian who kept the company of beasts and animals. Russ, to Horus, was an embarrassment, something to look down upon, and their meeting may have just planted the first seed of contempt in the Chthonian Primarch's heart. But as they went, the Great Crusade would gather more Primarchs, some from industrial worlds, some from feral death worlds. Some had become leaders, others slaves. No two Primarchs had the same experience, but each one brought something to the table the others did not. And at the front of their Space Marine legions, the Primarchs conquered the galaxy. The Emperor had his ultimate important mission he was working on in the background and decided to duck out of the Great Crusade, and he left Horus in charge, and bestowed upon the Primarch the title of War Master of the Imperium. Though he was supposed to be the first among equals, he soon became, in both his mind and the minds of many of his brothers, the favored and most exalted son of the Emperor. As for now, the Emperor is back on Terra, and he's fired up a device that was found during the Age of Technology, the Golden Throne. As long as he sits on this gigantic golden device and powers it with his psychic might, he has access to the Eldar's Webway, an ancient pocket dimension that allows interstellar travel without having to go through the warp. And the plan is to get the Webway portal on Terra permanently connected to the Webway, so that humans can access other human worlds easily and safely without fear of chaos attacks, something the Emperor is still lying to his sons and the Imperium about, still spreading the imperial truth, and denying that any gods exist, himself or otherwise. And speaking of imperial truth, the Emperor found out that the Primarch Lorgar was setting up cults that worshiped the Emperor as a god on every world he conquered. And for this, Lorgar and his Word-Bearers Legion were censured by the Emperor. On the world of Kur, the Word-Bearers had built an opulent city in honor of their god-emperor, named Monarchia, and it was a real jewel. But the Emperor sent Rabute Gilliman and the Ultramarines Legion to destroy Monarchia, and they absolutely razed the city. Then the Word-Bearers were forced to kneel in the ashes, pushed to their knees against their will by the psychic might of the Emperor. And this set in Lorgar a disdain for his father, who he had elevated to a god in his mind. And so Lorgar felt that even if the Emperor was a god, he was not deserving of worship, and so turned to chaos, the first Primarch to do so, and it would be agents of his legion, Erebus in particular, who would ultimately sow the seeds of corruption throughout the legions and spark the greatest civil war among humanity that the galaxy had ever seen. So while the Emperor is distracted with his Webway project, and the Great Crusade is winding down, Horus Lupercal is laid low by chaos on the world of Davin, barely clinging to life in a coma-like fugue. Horus is deceived into accepting the powers of chaos. He's slowly and methodically manipulated by the dark gods and their servants until little remains of his true self, and he just follows his own paranoia and delusions into damnation, not just for himself, but the whole of humanity. And so the greatest thing ever given to us by Games Workshop, the Horus Heresy, begins. The ultimate war that saw the loss of untold billions, led by the superhuman demigod sons of the Emperor himself. The entire galaxy would burn. But that is the subject of part 2, the next video. The Emperor is perhaps the most complex character in fiction, on a level far beyond even that of Leto Atreides, the Great Worm from the Dune saga. The Emperor is a galactic mind like none other. In part 1 of this series, we explored how the lore has changed over the years, looking at the conception and birth of the Master of Mankind through the ages of darkness and strife, as well as the horrific conquest of Terra known as the Unification Wars. And we ended with the Emperor's Great Crusade to conquer the galaxy and establish the Imperium of Man. So we're going to pick up where we left off, or actually a little before that, and backtrack to the Council of Nikea, because it was at this council, which was more or less the trial of Magnus the Red, that the roots of the Imperium's demise began to take hold. Just as the Great Crusade was winding down and the legions of the Adeptus Astartes and their Primarch generals were finishing up with the absolute subjugation and conquest of the galaxy, as the Great Crusade chewed through the galaxy, world after world they encountered happened to be under the control of chaos. But the Emperor had not yet revealed the power of chaos to his sons, or anyone in the Imperium, as it was still a heavily guarded secret, known only to the Emperor, Malcador, and Constantine Valdor apparently. Correct me in the comments if I'm misremembering this. Oh yeah, and the Emperor had warned his Primarch son, Magnus the Red, who was a sorcerer already succumbing to the powers and corrupting influence of chaos. Either way, it is known to less than a handful of people outside of the Emperor. So the legions keep coming across foes that are wielding sorcery, and they come to realize that this is derived from the powers of the warp. But the Emperor knows that mankind is not yet ready to wield the powers of the warp. Man was not yet physically, psychically, or spiritually ready to resist the temptations of warp entities, and not really able to fully restrain their powers, lacking the strength to fully control them. So, to the Emperor, he knew man was becoming more and more psychic as time went on, and that the people of the Imperium were evolving into something greater, warp-touched humans who were on the verge of awakening to being something more akin to the Eldar. This is why he wanted to shut down the use of psychic powers and forbid them to non-sanctioned psychers and astropaths. And Mortarion, Primarch of the Death Guard Legion, was pretty butthurt that his brother Magnus the Red and his Legion of the Thousand Sons were constantly using and studying warp-fueled sorcery of the same variety that the legions were encountering across the worlds they were conquering. And the Emperor let Mortarion have his say, more or less. And yeah, the Death Guard Primarch narked on his brother because Mortarion not only smells like feces, but he's a snitch too. And then there's Layman Russ, the Space Wolves Primarch. And Russ had a lot of strong opinions on combat and honor. And to Layman, the Thousand Sons' use of sorcery was something they found very, very dishonorable. Russ was a real smack 'em with a sword in an honorable duel kind of chivalrous, knightly dude. To him, using sorcery like Magnus or deception like Alfarius was cowardly, dishonorable, and beneath the Space Marine legions. Of course, each Primarch had their own opinions on this subject, and each one thought that their worldview, galaxy view, was the end-all be-all way for the Imperium to move forward. So of course Mortarion and Russ, given the opportunity to make their case against sorcery, did so, unknowingly setting Magnus on a path that would ultimately see his legion damned, his soul shattered, and his ascension to demonhood. But his brother's accusations and attacks all led to Magnus pleading his case that knowledge is not evil, it is how you use it that is good or evil. But the Emperor didn't really see it that way, and he knew that certain knowledge, primarily that of chaos, the warp, and the dark gods, could absolutely corrupt. And he knew that whatever price was required for him to have created the Primarchs, well, it was still an unpaid tab. And so for Magnus to go poking around in the warp, using his sorcerer's powers to cause near constant shenanigans, was a risk he wasn't willing to take. And so Magnus was admonished publicly. Basically, he got laughed at and called nerd by his father and many of his brothers. And the Space Marine legions and Imperial Guard were forbidden from practicing sorcery of any kind during this period. So the legions each shut down their librarius, and their psychers were integrated into regular combat roles within their respective legions. Some legions did not comply at all with this, such as the White Scars. And Magnus did leave the Council of Nikea, having been admonished and openly stating that he would comply fully with his father's edict, that neither he nor his legion of sorcerers would practice the dark arts ever again. But he had his fingers crossed, and he was totally lying. And so, having been expelled from Hogwarts, Magnus was now on the path to damnation. The librarians and Magnus had pled their case as well, and ultimately should have been listened to. But the Emperor was super mad at Magnus for his use of the arcane arts, and realized that as Magnus spoke, and his brothers, as well as the Sisters of Silence, testified against him, that Magnus was using the powers of chaos, even though he didn't fully and completely understand yet what chaos was. He was still the only one of the primarchs that the Emperor had shared the true nature of the warp with, even if it was a glossed over rudimentary education in it. The Emperor felt like, damn, you're the one I trusted with this, and you messed it up so bad you were literally using sorcery. What the hell, Magnus? So since the Emperor was so pissed at his son, he basically pulled the plug on all sorcery, more or less out of spite. Some of the primarchs and all of the librarians felt like this was a rash decision, and it was. The Emperor was furious. Magnus had been warned, and it was made very clear to him, and yet he disobeyed. But had he not? Then when the time came and the Webway project was operational, Magnus would have been perhaps the most important being in the Imperium, as it had been Big E's intention that Magnus sit upon the Golden Throne and maintain the Webway. But Luke always rushes off to face Vader before he's ready, trained, or even slightly prepared beyond learning to do front flips. That's just how it goes. Big E should have known this, and he's seen Star Wars. Out of the mess that was the Council of Nikea, the Space Marine legions may have lost, for the time, their librarians. But the new position of chaplain was created to keep the legionnaires in line with the imperial truth. Within the Wordbearers Legion, they would become horrific, demagogical preachers of the dark gods. And now we are to the Horus Heresy, the single greatest event in Warhammer 40K that happened 10,000 years before Warhammer 40K, but is still so important it dominates everything. And this isn't necessarily for reasons of historical continuity, it's just when the battle lines were ultimately drawn. When humanity was faced with the choice, proceed down a very dark and dangerous path fraught with all sorts of terrors and peril in the hope of holding mankind together, or trying to tear that down and establish a new order where everything you've fought and massacred worlds for actually will mean something, but we'll get to that. People have a lot of takes on the Horus Heresy and hold many beliefs to the point of absolute maniacal tribalism. If you don't believe me, take a look at the comments on a Primarch tier list video. Not just mine, anybody's. And it's no different in the setting, in universe, than it is here in the real world. But this video isn't about that greatest of conflicts that humanity has ever known. It is about the Emperor. So what was Big E doing during this galactic civil war? He's the most powerful man in the universe, and the most powerful psyker that may have ever existed. So why did he just not come out and put his son Horus down when the fighting started? Why didn't the Emperor just make his presence known and set the record straight? Well, the answer is more complicated than he was just on his golden throne working on the Webway. No, it is actually much, much darker than that. And there are hints all throughout the lore that he didn't really care. The Emperor wanted the Primarchs to fight and to wipe each other out as much as possible. There wasn't really much room for his warlords in the future of the Imperium. Or so Horus thought. It does turn out that there is plenty of evidence to suggest that this is not fully true, such as the building of opulent living quarters for the Primarchs in the Imperial Palace. So there is evidence to suggest that perhaps the Emperor wanted certain Primarchs with him after the Great Crusade, ruling the galaxy at his side. But where it is dark and where Horus's paranoia would have kicked into high gear is that Malkador openly stated on more than one occasion that Primarchs were just playing pieces in a game of galactic regicide. The Emperor and Malkador were manipulating the greatest armies of super soldiers ever to exist, simply as a game of chess. I guess when you're playing with that much power, then the consequences of your games have real-world implications. So in the story The Last Council, we get a peek at how this is the case. Malkador sees the Primarchs almost as sons, but the Emperor does not. Still, they deliberately pit the Primarchs against one another, knowing that when the smoke clears, there will be less Space Marines for the Custodes to have to purge like the Thunder Warriors. So yes, Big E was sitting on the Golden Throne working on the Webway, but Malkador was watching over the Imperium for him. And let's not beat around the bush here. Both the Emperor and Malkador are absolute power-drunken psychopaths at this point, and they know it. But they have to approach everything with absolute pragmatism. as they are the ones who may have to make the calls that see trillions of souls die, if it saves mankind as a whole, or even 1,000,000,001 other souls. On the surface, Malcador and the Emperor appear to be villainous, terrible warlords, but everything they do, including the sacrifice of worlds, systems, extincting whole Xenos races and human cultures, is all being done for the ultimate good of mankind. Or so the Emperor believes. Or at least, says he believes. Neoth, the new man, having conquered the galaxy and having pitted the conquering armies against one another, remember that bargain he made with the Chaos Gods? Was finally ruling over the enormous empire he'd taken tens of thousands of years to unify. But the powers of chaos heaped so many gifts upon the traitors that they ultimately were able to challenge the throne. And for such a prescient mind, the Emperor really must have been naive if he thought that legions like the World Eaters and the Death Guard were still loyal. And even my favorite legion, the Alpha Legion, turned on him, or did they? And when the dust settled, the Imperium's forces were reduced dramatically, losing almost the entirety of the Raven Guard, Iron Hands, and Salamander's legions, as well as the primarchs Vulcan and Ferrus Manus. Fully half the legion sided with Horus, and the traitors were carving up his new empire like a hot knife through butter. Still, the Emperor remains on the throne, working on the webway. As the galaxy burned, and as trillions of humans perished in the most horrific war imaginable, as brother slew brother, including the primarchs, the Emperor kept working on the webway, completely detached from events, trusting in Malcador to run the Imperium in his stead, unaware that things were going so badly. And this is when Magnus openly broke the Edict of Nikea and sought to communicate to the Emperor that Horus had turned traitor. Magnus the Red used sorcery to breach the wards around the Imperial Palace, blasting a massive hole in the webway and allowing demons to pour into it from the warp. It was a massive mistake and ruined everything the Emperor had been working on his entire existence, basically in an instant. Big E was so pissed that he didn't even bother hearing what Magnus had to say, really. The Emperor was not believing that his favorite son Horus would ever even think so much as a thought against him. He thought that it was Magnus who had turned to chaos and that Magnus was lying, and dispatched Layman Russ and the Space Wolves Legion to go fetch Magnus and haul him back to Terra to be put in timeout. While the Emperor was dealing with the massive breach and the hordes of demons literally attacking the Mechanicum workers building the webway, Russ set off for Prospero to go and get Magnus, who he had always treated with disdain as Russ hated sorcery so much. So we see the road to hell is paved with good intentions, as Magnus tried to do the right thing but brought ruin upon the entire galaxy. A lot of people in the community say Magnus did nothing wrong and the Emperor should have warned him about chaos and the warp and what would happen, except that is wrong. The Emperor gave him multiple second chances, warned him repeatedly, and initially Magnus was the only Primarch and the only one other than Malcador and Valdor to be trusted with the truth of chaos. Yes, Magnus knew what he was doing, but took the risk anyway, as the message he was trying to communicate was so dire. It is truly tragic, but Russ didn't go to Prospero doing the Emperor's bidding. Layman Russ was on the way there when Horus gave him new orders. Russ did not yet know that Horus was a traitor, and so still considered him War Master and his commanding officer. So Russ did what Horus said, and Russ went to Prospero to destroy the Space Wolves and kill Magnus. This all ultimately led to the Space Wolves being distracted, Magnus turning to Tzeentch, the rubric of Ahriman and the Legion turning to dust, and the Thousand Suns fleeing into the Eye of Terror to the planet of the Sorcerers. So the galaxy is burning, worlds are being destroyed outright, whole Titan legions are being deployed like it's nothing. The Imperium is in a no-holds-barred, drag-out, bare-knuckle brawl to the death. Lorgar is really who is to blame, ultimately. Lorgar the Primarch, Erebus the first chaplain, and Corferon the first captain of the Word-Bearers. After the raising of Monarchia and the humiliation the Emperor and the Ultramarines visited upon the Word-Bearers Legion, they turned their backs on the Emperor. Though Lorgar still considered his father a god, he considered him not worthy of worship, and he and his boys went on a search to see if the old gods of Colchis, their homeworld, were real. And indeed, they very much were, and Lorgar and the Wordbearers became the first true Chaos Space Marines. But even though the Emperor had totally screwed over the Wordbearers, he also naively thought they would stay loyal, and were one of the legions he sent to reign Horus in, and one of the legions that betrayed their brothers at Istvan V during the Dropsite Massacre, where, as I mentioned earlier, the Raven Guard were killed nearly to a man, taking over 90% casualties. Vulcan was killed, or thought to have been, and the Salamanders were absolutely butchered. And the Iron Hands got smoked too. Their Primarch Varus Manus was beheaded by his brother and best friend. Horus was ready after Istvan. He was ready to press on for Terra, a war that would grind on for years, but eventually the traitors would arrive in the solar system and come to challenge the throne. The major irony is that Horus rebelled because of a vision he received when poisoned by a chaos-tainted blade. That's the subject of another video, one on the Horus Heresy. But basically, Horus was shown a future where the Emperor erased him and his brothers from history, turned on them, and purged them, and would let go of the imperial truth so that he could ascend to godhood and rule over everything. And this is ironic because it was the vision of the future that came to pass because he rebelled. But Horus misinterpreted this, chaos shenanigans or whatever, and set off to go kill his dad for betraying them all and bringing about the exact future he set off to fight against. But back to Big E, who is still stuck dealing with the Webway disaster, trying to keep Terra from being overrun by demons. He communicates to Malkador and Rogel Dorn that they are to manage the defense of Terra and fighting of the traitors, as he's dealing with a crisis that is pretty much just as big, and he's the only one strong enough to psychically do the job. But the Emperor also communicates with an astropath named Kai Zalane via telepathy, and they had been granted visions of the future and the ultimate fate of the Emperor at the hands of Horus. And the Emperor reveals to Kai that he not only knows what is coming and his ultimate fate, but he accepts it basically as his penance, as the cost of failing humanity. This is where the Emperor shows he's not just a total space tyrant and galactic Joseph Stalin, but has some depth of emotion and love for humanity, if not for any single human, for the entirety of humans. I did say earlier he'd let 1 trillion die to save 1,000,000,001. Let's update that to he'd kill 1 trillion to save 1,000,000,001. But yeah, the Emperor of Mankind knows what is coming for him. He knows the dark future that exists and puts it all on his own shoulders, considering it all a result of his failure. Wow, what a narcissist. But then again, the guy has been lying to everyone about being a god, and I can't imagine what kind of narcissism being a god causes. It must be pretty extreme, honestly. Primarch of the Raven Guard, Corvus Corax, comes to the Imperial Palace to seek an audience with his father, and Corax is turned away. He is not to disturb his father, the Emperor, who is too busy working on the Webway. But the Emperor does something here that is really cool, and he telepathically communicates with Corvus. Since the Raven Guard were slaughtered, and there were only a handful of survivors, the Emperor tells Corvus Corax how to access his laboratories and bypass a ton of secret booby traps and safety protocols, how to actually use the Gene Lab to create new Space Marines. The Raven Guard Primarch was the only Primarch trusted with such insanely secretive knowledge. It didn't bring Corvus completely out of his super depression, but it could have eventually if the Alpha Legion hadn't ruined everything. So, after sitting on the Golden Throne for 5 years, the Emperor was showing signs of exhaustion. His nose was bleeding sometimes, and this even showed in his psychic visions that he'd used to communicate with the Legiones Custodes through the Tribune Ra Endymion. It was at this time that the Emperor sensed the birth of the terrible demon Dracnean in the Warp, the demon who becomes the sword wielded by Abaddon the Despoiler in the future. But yeah, the Emperor realizes the war in the Webway is wrapping up, and he orders the Sisters of Silence to gather up 1,000 Psychers and sacrifice them to the Golden Throne to help power it. Again, he's getting exhausted. So the sacrifice allowed the throne to be powered for a single day, and he used this to physically enter the Webway and rescue the retreating human forces and subdue the demon Dracnean. but only by trapping it and binding it into the body of his tribune, Ra Endymion. The Emperor then ordered this most loyal of servants to run as far and deep into the webway as he could to keep the demon away from humanity, and then he was forced to shut the webway portal and get back on the Golden Throne. The Emperor lamented to those in his presence and those he communicated to psychically that with the webway project in total ruination, the inevitable fate of mankind was ultimately to meet the same doom as the Eldari, to become extinct, slowly destroyed by chaos and consumed. And the Emperor basically has his first nervous breakdown in an existential crisis. I guess he hit middle age or whatever, but he admits that he doesn't know what to do to save humanity from extinction. For the first time in his unimaginably long life, the Emperor did not know what to do. So ultimately it took 7 years for Horus to reach Terra and challenge the throne world with his massive forces and fleets and the traitor primarchs as his generals. And the Emperor had to sit on the Golden Throne the entire time. Except for a few moments he could relinquish the responsibility to Malcador the Sigillite. But it was a huge strain, even on the Emperor, so it was way too much for Malcador. Still, he gave his friend and master reprieve on occasion. But the war grinds on, the traitors not able to penetrate the palace's defenses due to some amazing heroics from some total badasses like Sanguinius and Rogel Dorn. But the traitor primarchs were totally fierce and they were close to victory on the ground. The arch-traitor Horus Lupercal would lower the void shields on his flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, in a taunt to the Emperor. He's literally like, let's fight this out ourselves, one-on-one, like when Saddam wanted to box George W. Bush, except the Emperor took Horus up on this offer. Big E gets up off the Golden Throne and leads a strike force to Horus's flagship, teleporting on board with his crew to go finally put down the nonsense shenanigans his favorite son was up to, and also put down his favorite son. This is where the lore was massively changed recently, or perhaps we should say, it was elaborated upon and added to in such a way that it puts pretty much the entirety of what we've known as canon lore for decades into question. And I, for one, think it's pretty awesome. The old lore, what we have known in the rulebooks since 2nd edition, has changed a bit with each edition. But the End in the Death has given us a lot of new, clearer, or even contradictory depictions of those events. There are some real bangers in here, and the possible threads of future plots they could follow are predictably innumerable. But before we get into the final battle, the End in the Death, I want to address one thing that just, well, it totally sucks. And I mean, it really pisses me off. And that is the battle between Horus and Sanguinius, which we'll get to. But first I have to give a shout out to the old lore on this one. Sanguinius had originally landed a blow on Horus that put a chink in his armor, which the Emperor exploited. So Sanguinius' ultimate sacrifice was completely for a reason. He gave his life to deliver that blow, which ultimately allowed the Emperor to prevail. This is no longer the case, and like I said, we'll get to what it is now, but just had to get that out of the way, as Sanguinius' sacrifice, how and why it happened, has always been one of the most compelling things about the character to me. I mean, what a total badass, unparalleled in every way. Maybe they wanted to reduce some of the luster around the Angel of Death and make him a little less perfect, but I do feel he gets robbed hard by the new lore, and honestly, I am only just now realizing that I need to make this video as a way to deal with that. So I guess this is therapy to talk about it? Okay, moving on then. So the strike force that the Emperor left with for the Vengeful Spirit consisted of Big E, Rogel Dorn and his contingent of Imperial Fists, Sanguinius and a contingent of Blood Angels, and the Custodes. The Emperor felt it was futile, but it was all he had left, and so he went on to the ship, but the teleportation scattered the champions from one another, as the Vengeful Spirit was acting as a massive warp gate at that point, and was a locus for warp energies coming through and dominating the entire solar system. And this effectively meant that when they were scattered on the Vengeful Spirit, they were scattered through the warp, or some aspect of it. Sanguinius was the first to find Horus, and it did not go as it did in the old lore. Sanguinius had been battling all day, multiple greater demons of Khorne, including Angron of the World Eaters. The demon Primarch had been dispatched or dealt with by Sanguinius, and he was battered. He was the best duelist of all the Primarchs and was said to have been able to take any of them in a fight. But yet, when he faced Horus, he stood no chance. And not because he was already exhausted and battered, but because Horus was swollen with the power of all four Chaos Gods. They had heaped so many rewards upon him. He was oozing with power. Palpable waves of Empyrean energies wafting off of him, undulating between the warp and real space. Horus was ascended, and well beyond the power of even the Emperor of Mankind. Sanguinius, well, he was a prescient being and had visions of the future. He knew his death at the hands of Horus was imminent, and he went with the strike team aboard the Vengeful Spirit. But he also wanted to change that fate. And so understanding that, because he was doing the exact same thing himself, the Emperor allowed Sanguinius to go. Horus battered Sanguinius to a pulp with the Great Maul Worldbreaker, caved his head in like Gallagher smashing a watermelon, and turned it to goo. Completely desecrating Sanguinius' body, he hung it up in mockery, displaying the mutilated corpse for the Emperor to see, his perfect son destroyed upon his arrival. But getting to Horus was not such an easy task for the Emperor. In that journey through the Vengeful Spirit, the final fight with Horus Lupercal, and the Emperor's internment on the Golden Throne are the subjects of the third part of this series. The End and the Death Part 3 is beyond anything I imagined it would be. An incredible piece of writing for sure, and an epic end to one of the greatest sci-fi story arcs of all time, the Horus Heresy and the Siege of Terra. But it was brutal. And I mean, it was like the fight between Horus and Sanguinius in terms of brutality, but it just kept going and going and going. Like the meme that South Park used in their Cripple Fight episode, the fight between Rowdy Roddy Piper and Keith David in John Carpenter's documentary film They Live, this is like watching someone get kicked in the balls over and over for hours on end. At a certain point I was like, okay, that's gotta be it. This should be wrapping up any time now. And it just kept pounding on like the Energizer Bunny. And I, for one, being the sadomasochist that I am, loved every glorious minute of it. So, in my typical fashion, I'm going to go through and look at the fight, the end, and the death. The last episode of this series ended with the Emperor and his boarding party teleporting off to the Vengeful Spirit to face Horus. That is where we will continue from. So Horus had lowered the shields on the Vengeful Spirit, taunting the Emperor to come face him. He knows he's torqued up, absolutely Arnoldarian in proportion to his regular demigod self, drunk on the juice of all four of the Chaos Gods, and he knows that the Emperor is no match for him. But the War Master also knows that Guilliman is only 9 hours away from arriving at Terra. The Lion and Russ are on the way too. He knows it's now or never. It's all or nothing. But the Emperor took the bait and went to end it all. One thing we learn is that he knew what the outcome was likely to be, and yet he went to face his fate anyway. Now, I did a video on Sanguinius and his battle with Horus and how Games Workshop massively changed it. So if you've seen that, you'll know what I'm talking about. But the Emperor let the Great Angel come along on the boarding action for the same reason he went as well. Sanguinius shared his vision of his own death at the hands of Horus with his father, and so the Emperor, realizing that the angel was trying to do the exact same thing he himself was doing, trying to change fate, allowed his son to go. Now, they didn't just teleport up to the Vengeful Spirit and start wrecking face. They got scattered. And by scattered, I mean thrust into different dimensions, warp pockets, and strange places. Rogel Dorn ended up in an infinite desert, being tempted by Khorne for perceived centuries. Valdor was scattered away from the Emperor. Sanguinius was first to face Horus. So let's dive into what happened, and while it is neither pretty nor surprising, it is actually quite a bit different than the lore that has existed for decades. Or rather, the lore on the lore, as the final fight had never actually been covered until the Siege of Terra series came up to the end, with the End and the Death 3. Big E hits the ground running, and I mean, he's in a hangar aboard the Vengeful Spirit, and he's got the entire length of the ship to go through until he gets to Horus at the Lupercal's court. Big E just walks through fire, literally, like an absolute boss, like the master of mankind and like the pissed off dad of the guy whose ass he's on his way to beat. Just nothing breaks his stride. Now, some very telling, terrible, and intense things happened as the Emperor walked, chest puffed out. Nothing, literally nothing, standing in his way. He had to kill his custodies after Horus was able to corrupt them, and that made him really mad. He battled demons and chaos forces. He restored his custodies to life. He drank in the power of the warp, and stood on the threshold of becoming the 5th Chaos God, fully knowing that it would give him the power to defeat Horus. And he drank in the life force of his own custodies. Wow, those guys had it rough in this. Kaikaltis Dusk was protected from the dark force the Emperor was becoming, a ball of darkness roiling with lightning, the Dark King, because Malcador the Sigillite had marked his breastplate with a sigil that somehow protected him, some ancient magic. But after a really old friend came to him and appeared in that key moment, in fact the Emperor's oldest friend, the Perpetual whose name literally means old person, he was talked into shedding the mantle of the Dark King. Olanius Person was able to convince Big E that if what he was doing was for humanity, then he needed to do it as a man, not as a god. Well-intentioned or not, mankind did not need a 5th Chaos God to contend with. I mean, there was a lot of reasoning, but ultimately the Emperor knew that Person was right. He shed the Dark King aspect and did not ascend to godhood, to the relief of Malcador, who was sitting in absolute agony on the Golden Throne, holding it down like the hero he was eventually to be known as. Even though he wasn't assured to win anymore, the Emperor knew that facing Horus as the master of mankind was the only legit way. Despite becoming a god must have been very tempting. But the Emperor had to cut off a huge chunk of himself to shed the Dark King, and he gave up his compassion and love. Basically had to become totally emotionless and psychopathic just to even attempt the mission ahead. But he walks on with the proconsul of the Custodes, Kaikaltis Dusk. Eventually Litu and Garbiel Loken join his posse, and Loken is probably my absolute favorite Astarte of all time, up there with Salt Harvitz and Nathaniel Garo. They fight on and on and on, and the Emperor refuses to be impeded. Nothing can even slow him down. He just strides on forward, just mowing everything down in his path. And eventually, as the Emperor is walking through the ship, Constantine Valdor is fighting the Justaran Terminators, the elite of the Sons of Horus under First Captain Abaddon. Dorn eventually makes it out of the desert by being more stubborn than even Khorne can handle. It was literally like trying to convince an anvil of the principles of calculus for the Blood God. The great angel Sanguinius is horrifically slain by the War Master Horus Lupercal, and one of the most gruesome splatterpunk scenes ever written. And the Blood Angels go totally mad with the Black Rage as the death of the angel sweeps across the Vengeful Spirit in Terra, like a hurricane of javelins slamming into the Blood Angels and destroying their sanity. Big E knows it, Big E feels it, and he doesn't care. He cannot care. He cut that part of himself away to keep from becoming a warpaholic, as Horus would later call him, most hypocritically. The Emperor knows that he should hurt, that the loss of the angel should at least strike him as hard as wrecking a new car or his house burning down, but there's nothing. And he can then face his wayward son Horus. This battle is so different than I thought it was going to go. It was delivered mostly from the perspective of Horus Lupercal, talking to himself in second person, analytically. He's assessing events even as they unfold, and he is cold, calculating, and in absolute terror. He's more like something from a cosmic horror, the dark god who thinks he's still a man, than a video game end boss like he used to feel like before they fleshed this out. Big E and his posse roll up into Horus's crib, taking in the corruption of the Lupercal's court. And it is quite a scene, as Horus has strung up the absolutely desecrated, smashed, skull-shattered, contorted, broken, bloodied body of Sanguinius like a trophy, a mockery, a taunt to his father, a boast, and a promise. Horus wants to talk. He wants to explain all he has done and why he is right and his father is wrong. Horus wants to seriously have a long monologue that he personally feels will let the Emperor see that he is indeed so justified in his actions, and the Emperor so wrong in his own actions, that the Master of Mankind will practically beg for Horus to end him just because he messed everything up so badly and betrayed everyone, especially his primarch sons and the Space Marines, etc. Horus literally wants to have some daddy issue therapy session and get healed on an emotional level as a prelude to bashing his father's skull in with Worldbreaker. The Emperor just stares right through his son, right past him, and brings his gaze to meet the big four who stand behind Horus, the gods of chaos. And he just keeps saying the same thing over and over, really getting Horus hot under the collar and bringing up his blood pressure. He keeps saying, "You have killed my son." And if you listen to the audiobook version, the narration is so top-notch, and this line is delivered so well, it's kind of chilling. Horus thinks that the Emperor is talking to him, and thinks that the Emperor is referring to Sanguinius. And being the narcissist he is, he cannot see the truth of it, cannot see that he is not the most important thing going on here. Horus only sees his father looking at what he assumes is him. And when he keeps responding with these really long-winded, bloviated speeches, and his father just keeps saying the same one line over and over, "You have killed my son," Horus about loses it. I mean, some of his rants were just completely pedantic. I mean, they were nearly encyclopedic, just blowing hot air up his own ass for minutes on end. And trust me, there's nothing that gets to a narcissist worse than just completely ignoring them. It takes him a very uncomfortable amount of time before he realizes that the Emperor is not talking to him, but about him, to the Big Four, to Nurgle, Tzeentch, Khorne, and Slaanesh respectively. The son the Emperor is referring to is Horus, not Sanguinius. And this makes him super pissed. He knows that the Emperor didn't care to hear one single word he uttered, wasn't paying attention, and was communicating directly with the gods from which he was drawing his immeasurable power. And they start fighting. After a very long, very uncomfortable reunion. To say that it was an epic fight is a massive understatement. I do not know if such an event has ever adequately, until now, been put down on paper before. It would be epic, legendary, a saga for the ages if it took place in our one singular reality. But this fight, the final showdown between evil and eviler, between Chaos Ascended Warmaster, traitor, heretic, Horus Lupercal, and the Master of Mankind, Neoth, the New Man, Big E himself, the Truth and the Light, Space Daddy Super Jesus Alexander the Greatest Ever, yeah, it got crazy across all space and time, across an infinity of realities. And it took place physically as well. It got really insane, and 1,000 dominoes had to line up just perfectly. Dominoes that were not anywhere near under the Emperor's control for the Master of Mankind to prevail. The beating that they both took was on the same level as the beating that Sanguinius took from Horus only moments before. I mean, it got bad. It cut to the bone. They were both dealt the kinds of wounds from which there is no recovery. Physical wounds, psychic wounds, and worst of all, emotional wounds. It got psychedelic and crazy when Horus was bringing down Worldbreaker in an attempt to smash the Emperor and literally crush his head. And the Emperor didn't block with his sword, but with an entire alternate reality. Their fight takes place through multiple dimensions across countless worlds and battlefields, across infinite memories of the wars they waged across the stars to forge the Imperium in tidal waves of blood. The Emperor blocks Horus's death blow with his own treachery, bringing him right to Istvan, to the original treachery. And Horus takes it to Molech and calls out the Emperor's hypocrisy. But the Emperor is on the back foot the entire time. He shed the mantle of godhood, and Horus, ever deluded by his own self-aggrandizement, thinks he has ascended to godhood himself. Horus, in his hubris, thinks himself the equal of Khorne and Nurgle, Slaanesh, and Tzeentch. He thinks they have made him the fifth god, the Dark King, because he was such a swell guy. He's fallen that far into his own worst weakness, his narcissism. Without that, Horus would have been incorruptible. but Chaos exploited him where they could, and that was the weak link in the chain that was Horus, the chink in the armor. And it took everything for the Emperor to prevail. He had to literally and figuratively die, and pull some seriously underhanded moves. But at one point he's nearly unconscious. He's battered and broken and even physically shattered, still barely clinging to life, yet his will keeps him standing. He can't even speak. And Horus, still wanting to bloviate, still wanting to opine about how awesome he is and how righteous his cause is. He's literally talking to the Emperor as he's killing him, as if his father is a fan of what he's doing. He's so deluded. But he won't shut up and wants to talk all that trash before bringing his maul down on his father to end it all, and Big E leans against him, falling into his son's chest. And Horus thinks it's pathetic, and all his father can do, but Big E is literally low-key leeching power from Horus, like a mosquito, vampirically sucking power from his son. And when Horus realizes it, the Emperor has already gained just enough power to renew the fight. And Horus calls him out. He's like, "Dad, you're a basehead for the warp, a warpaholic. And you want to ground me for being one too?" So they keep fighting, and the Emperor gets wounded so horribly that he's bleeding his perpetuality. He's bleeding centuries of time, of life force, of vitality. He's literally bleeding his immortality across all space-time. And the Emperor is constantly on the back foot during the fight, or fights, as there are countless parallel fights across infinite realities going on. He has to use every trick, every move, everything he knows to hang with Horus. But Horus is a bit deluded, thinking he's all that, and forgetting that the gifts the gods gave him are not his natural state. The Emperor does not forget this, and knows it's his only chance. And at one point, Big E has Horus on his knees, about to deliver the killing blow, very similar to Sanguinius. And Horus heals. He was mortally wounded many times over, and yet heals. The gods are truly favoring Horus. But some key things happen, mostly involving those who were with the Emperor, namely the Custodes, Proconsul Kaikaltus Dusk, Garviel Loken, Leetu, and the Perpetuals Olanius Person and John Grammaticus. They deserve their own videos, and we'll get them, but some of the things they did were so tied to the fate of the galaxy, the Emperor and Horus, they have to be mentioned. So Horus obliterates Dusk, who sacrifices himself to save the Emperor at one point. He had survived the Emperor's destruction of the corrupted Custodes due to the sigillite magic symbol that Malcador, the hero, had drawn upon his breastplate. But Horus, shooting a beam of pure bloodlight out of the eye on his own breastplate, disintegrated Dusk entirely, and it is hinted that it was across all dimensions and in the warp. Horus erased Dusk's soul entirely. The heroism of the companions of the Emperor, and to a lesser extent Horus as well, with Abaddon and the Justarin and the Mournival, it is all over the top in this book. It gets to near Sanguinius levels of selfless sacrifice and "for the Emperor-ing." How Dan Abnett made it so that we feel for even Abaddon and respect his point of view even if we don't agree with it, but also sets the stage for it to be perfectly fine if we do. It's writing on a level that is just insane. Horus flings Leetu into the Chaos Realm, and he literally is there, before the gods themselves, the Big Four. And he's so small and insignificant compared to them, that he thinks that he may be perceiving part of one's claw. But the nail of that claw is kilometers high, reaching into the sky, and he's like a speck of dust to it. His eyes cannot take in the full scale of them, but he knows they're there. Old Person, Olanius Person, appears and gives the Emperor the Anathame Blade, but steps in front of Horus and buys the Emperor a moment, and Horus ends him too, supposedly a final end for the oldest human perpetual known in the setting. Horus has the Emperor nailed to his throne in the Lupercal court, impaled several times over with giant shurikens that the Emperor was using against Horus, conjured during one of Big E's big comebacks. I mean, this was a super back and forth, knockdown, drag out fight, and only because of two reasons. First, the Emperor is smarter and more experienced than Horus, and is seeing clearly. But second, Horus just wants to prolong it a bit, as he literally cares more about imparting his feelings to his father, and his justifications, however delusional they are. saying his piece and aggrandizing himself is almost more important to him than victory. He does try to convince the Emperor to come to his side and rule along with him, which is kind of a reverse Darth Vader move. I appreciated that for what it was. But Horus cannot sway the Emperor, so he mentions Moloch and blocks with a reality shift of his own, and we get a little peek behind the curtain at the deal the Emperor made with the Chaos Gods. The Emperor is actually wounded by this, but yeah, eventually he's nailed to a chair several times over. His head is bashed, his eye melted out, his armor rent, arm shattered, back broken. The Emperor was made to suffer as bad as Sanguinius. Eventually he makes it off his chair, and if I remember correctly, this happened when Kaikaltis Dusk was protecting the Emperor from Horus, literally being melted by the bloodlight. And they fight some more, but Horus brings Worldbreaker down and crushes the Emperor's skull. The old man is lying there looking dead. I mean, everyone thinks he's dead. And Horus starts bloviating again about how it was justified and how his rule will be different. But Big E is not dead. He's mentally projecting to be Garviel Loken, the son of Horus and member of the Mournival. And he's telling Horus that he must now shed the dark aspect he's taken on, that he hasn't fully killed his father yet, and he must do so as a primarch, not as a god. And I put God in air quotes here, but he's playing into Horus's vanity, his ego. And then he asks if Horus is going to rule the Imperium going forward as the man, the Primarch Horus, or as the god, the Dark King Horus. Eventually Horus's own ego can't let it go. And he decides to go smash the Emperor's skull to pulp in a very unceremonious, unheroic, boring in his own eyes way, but as himself. Horus cast off the power the gods had swollen him with, and stood before his father as the man who had conquered the galaxy on his behalf. This all plays out to let us know that Big E played him hard, and had been reclaiming power, healing himself enough to fight Horus one last time, but had convinced Horus to throw away all the power he'd had, so Big E was finally stronger. And he gets wrecked, taking out his son. I mean ruined, absolutely destroyed. Horus pierces his throat with the Talon of Horus, smashes him with the Maul Worldbreaker. Horus is still a beast without the powers of the gods, but they realize his folly and hold back, refusing their power to him as punishment for casting it away, for daring to ever think he was his own man, even their equal. They want Horus to know he is a thrall. The Emperor shoves the anathema dagger into Horus's heart. As Horus sees the truth of what he's become, and that he cannot be trusted as he's obviously very corruptible, he begs his father to end it now, even as the Chaos Gods scrambled to flood their power back into Horus. The Emperor had the smallest window to end his son. And this is where the lore changed massively. He forgives Horus and tells him he will see him again. So now Horus is returnable to the setting. He's just killed, not obliterated utterly in the warp, which is a total role reversal with Sanguinius, who is now gone for good. Total oblivion, apparently. Big E hits Horus with so much psychic power that it detonates brighter than a supernova, and it just melts Horus. He boils the eyes out of Horus's head and melts the flesh off of his face. By the time that Rogel Dorn and Constantine Valdor arrive, Horus is just a dead shell on the floor, steaming and sizzling, reeking the place up with his smoldering flesh. Dorn thinks the Emperor is dead at first, but he finds Dusk's armor remains on the floor, and near it is a tarot card. Valdor and Dorn fight a bit over it at first, but Dorn declares that Litu, who has returned from the realm of chaos, is right. And Litu was insisting that the Emperor was trying to communicate with them in the only way he could. He was speaking through the tarot. Dorn thought the tarot was sorcerous and held it in contempt, as it had freaked him out badly earlier when Malcador had shown him the future using the tarot, and it came to pass. But he did know that the Emperor was into the tarot, and so was Malcador, and in his grief, Dorn declared that he could clearly read what the Emperor wanted from him. So he took his dad's body back to Terra and put him on the Golden Throne. The last thing that happened before the Emperor was interred was Malcador was removed from it, and he turned to dust. We get to see Malcador's thoughts on this, and he knows that the Emperor thought he'd failed and deserved the throne as his penance for failing mankind. But Malcador reveals the dark truth right before he dies. The Emperor is in for infinite suffering and agony on that throne. Pure and total horror. Malcador calls it the Throne of Terror. Every single moment is like an infinity of pain, and time is meaningless. 10,000 years later, the Emperor is still in that pain. Thousands of psychers a day are sacrificed to him and the throne, as he drinks their souls like a star vampire, all to sustain his physical form that he cannot heal. Just to keep the light of the Astronomicon lit and warp travel possible for the Imperium of Man, and to remain tethered to the physical world, as that masks his presence in the warp and protects him from the Chaos Gods. But the throne is now failing. The Emperor is slowly dying. His body is failing even as his soul grows in power in the warp. Face to face with his father for the first time in 10,000 years, Guilliman met with a being that was shattered into innumerable pieces of consciousness, as the agony of infinite torture has eroded the center, the grounding point for his father's sanity. He's called both son and also nothing but a tool by the Emperor, and he is called both traitor and the only salvation of mankind as well. Literally, the Emperor calls Rabute Guilliman his last hope, the last hope for the Imperium. And we see that the Emperor is crazy now, or what is left of him. The mind of the Emperor seems shattered into millions of pieces, constantly dealing with the agony of his existence. His body is a wrecked husk that needs to vampirically feed upon psychers and swallow their souls for sustenance. And his soul is a warp god, essentially, having grown to rival even the Big Four. And we see that when Big E resurrected Guilliman from Mortarian's god blight and torched the Garden of Nurgle, wounding the Chaos God himself, just how far Big E has come. Sometimes the Emperor is totally lucid and seems cohesive. Sometimes he's totally insane, and sometimes he isn't even available or there at all. But when he does intervene, it can be incredible, and it can turn the tide, even if his servants don't see why his will is the right path. Like when he tells Saint Celestine directly to let Cassar and the Unsung go, an Alpha Legion warband. It was better for mankind that Cassar and the Unsung escape with the beacon than to let it fall into the hands of the followers of the blood god Khorne, as the World Eaters are not really known for being the best guys out there, or having good intentions for people, to put it mildly. And because it is the Emperor's will, Saint Celestine fights Karn the Betrayer in melee combat to allow Cassar's escape. And it is crazy how much violence Karn does to Celestine. I mean, he butchers her Gemini bodyguard like nothing, and chops her head right off with his chain axe. And Celestine is good with that, knowing that she's dying to let what the Emperor commanded her to allow to come to pass, to actually come to pass. Her life is secondary. But Celestine is an Imperial saint and has the Emperor's attention in ways that others do not. Still, the Emperor will not last on the throne. Everything in the lore is leading to that. But remember when he threw off the mantle of the Dark King, he had to cast off his compassion and his goodness. He had to meet Horus without any weakness that Horus could exploit. And still, Horus found Molech was a sore spot and crushed the Emperor's ego by bringing it up. But that shard of the Emperor is still out there still. And apparently it is responsible for some of the actions attributed to the Emperor. This aspect of his soul is theorized to return, born anew when the Emperor's body finally gives out and he fully dies. The Star Child will be born, or so the prophecy goes. What the Emperor is now, whether it be God, man, or everything in between, he's fighting the good fight on behalf of humanity, day in and day out. He's been tortured, physically, psychically, and emotionally, for 100 centuries, nonstop. And if his agony were to cease for even a moment, then countless souls would perish. Juxtaposed with that, he's the star vampire, the soul sucker, the worst horror imaginable, that consumes the very souls of thousands of the most gifted humans that ever existed every single day. Untold billions have perished to slake the Emperor's thirst over the millennia, Each one sacrifice in extreme cosmic horror as their soul is consumed and ultimately just absorbed into the greater, homogenized soul soup the Emperor is composed of. You sustain his body and empower his will, but you lose all individuality. Your essence for eternity is absorbed and merged with his own. In just as many ways as the Emperor is the savior of humanity and all that is holding the Imperium together, he is also parasiting off of it. He's the curse that is our salvation, the darkness that is the light. Now here's where we go into a bit of speculation and maybe even conspiratorial thinking. But I for one think he's coming back, as in getting up off the throne and manifesting physically and in perfect health again. I do believe that he may have to die to do this, but it was strongly hinted that Dorn believed the Emperor would never heal from his wounds, that whatever Horus had done seems to be permanent, which was much of his justification for putting his father on the throne. But what if Dorn is wrong? That's one possibility, that the Emperor would have healed by now if only he wasn't enslaved by the throne that is literally sucking his essence away psychically, even as it sustains the husk of his physical form. He's been crying out in perpetual pain for 10,000 years, just trying to hold on, when he'd have been fine if they would have just gotten him off that chair. Or others speculate that he must die for the Star Child to be reborn, that his perpetuality is unknown to his sons and the Imperium in general, so slaying him would be the right move, as it would allow him to reincarnate. But Dorn, again, believed that the Emperor's wounds were not just something he would ever be able to heal from, and he didn't know of the perpetual nature of the Emperor. It was a case of the Praetor of Terra thinking he was doing the right thing, but his father's defeat and near death did completely crush him. Dorn was a broken man. So with this third part of my series on the Emperor concluded, we've seen his lore as it goes from birth to his internment on the Golden Throne in his perpetual near-death state of immeasurable agony. What do you all think? Will Games Workshop and Black Library return the Emperor to the setting of Warhammer 40,000? Can they do it in a way that makes sense? I think they will. Warhammer 40K is about to turn 40 years old, and with the delay of Pandemonium on purpose, it seems they are aligning all the pieces, setting the board for the ultimate narrative yet. Mark my words, 2 years from now, we'll have every Primarch back in the setting, and Big E will hit the tabletop with a glorious new model. And who knows, maybe if they do, the narrative surrounding it won't suck, and will actually serve to push this setting harder, further into the grimdark. Maybe that's wishful thinking, but one thing we can't deny, things are getting crazy for sure.